There is a war most people never see, yet they live daily with its consequences. It is not fought with bullets or ballots, but with authority, timing, and access. While the world sleeps, transactions are taking place, decisions are being ratified, permissions are being granted. Midnight is not merely a time on the clock, it is a threshold. Scripture repeatedly reveals that midnight is when chains fall, judgments are released, and destinies pivot. But what happens when that same hour is hijacked by the adversary? Many sincere people work tirelessly, plan wisely, and pray faithfully, yet remain trapped in cycles of financial frustration. The question is not effort, the question is jurisdiction. Who is speaking when you are silent? Who is legislating while you rest? The unseen realm does not respond to emotion, it responds to law, and laws operate whether we acknowledge them or not. In the coming year, 2026, financial systems will shake, transfer, and realign, but no earthly economy moves independently of a spiritual one. If you do not understand what is done in secret, you will never fully understand what is lost in public. Tonight, we are not here to chase fear. We are here to confront ignorance, expose patterns, and reclaim authority, because light is not intimidated by darkness, it simply reveals it. Midnight is not a superstition-driven concept. It is a biblically documented moment of transition, judgment, and authorization. Throughout Scripture, midnight appears as a hinge point where invisible decisions become visible outcomes. It is the hour when God struck Egypt, when chains fell off prisoners, when cries went up that shifted entire nations. This tells us something critical. Time itself can be weaponized. Midnight represents the crossing between days, the legal end of one cycle, and the legal beginning of another. In spiritual terms, it is a courtroom moment when cases are reviewed, verdicts are enforced, and permissions are either granted or revoked. Nothing significant happens by accident at midnight because midnight is about access. Those who operate in darkness understand this principle far better than most believers. They do not act randomly, they act strategically. They wait for moments when resistance is lowest, when vigilance is weakest, and when spiritual gates are naturally opening and closing. Midnight provides that opening. It is when spiritual traffic is least obstructed, when human distractions are minimal, and when ancient protocols are activated. This is why Scripture warns that the enemy does not sleep. The idea that night is neutral is a dangerous illusion. Night amplifies whatever authority is present. If righteousness is absent, unrighteousness fills the vacuum. Financial outcomes are often determined long before bank statements reflect them. At midnight, spiritual agreements concerning labor, harvest, loss, and limitation are reinforced. This is not mysticism, it is law. The unseen realm operates on structure, hierarchy, and timing. When covenants are renewed or invoked at transitional hours, they carry weight into the coming season. That is why some people experience unexplained delays, sudden reversals, or repetitive financial ceilings that defy logic. The problem is rarely effort, it is often timing combined with silence. Silence is interpreted as consent in the spiritual realm. If no higher authority contests an action, it proceeds by default. Midnight activities exploit this principle. They do not need your belief to function, they only need your absence. This is why Scripture emphasizes watchmen, vigilance, and awareness. Watchmen are not passive observers. They are legal representatives who stand at the gate to contest unlawful claims. When no one stands watch, gates are used by whoever arrives first. Understanding midnight as a strategic intersection changes how you view prayer, rest, and preparation. It reveals why certain breakthroughs require more than motivation and more than planning. They require alignment with divine timing and awareness of spiritual schedules. Midnight is not to be feared, but it must be understood. Light does not lose to darkness at midnight. Ignorance does. When truth occupies that hour, chains still fall, doors still open, and financial captivity still breaks. Not because the hour is evil, but because authority has been correctly exercised within it. Words spoken long before you were born can still be speaking over your life. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about the unseen realm, yet it is also one of the most consistent patterns found in Scripture and history. Covenants do not expire simply because time passes. They expire only when they are legally fulfilled, replaced, or judged invalid by a higher authority. At midnight, these covenants are often revisited, reinforced, or reactivated because midnight represents renewal points in spiritual systems. Bloodline agreements, ancestral oaths, and spoken dedications are not emotional memories. They are legal instruments that demand continuity. Those who practice dark spiritual systems understand lineage better than most believers. They track bloodlines, names, family professions, repeated losses, and inherited patterns because they know that inheritance works both materially and spiritually. If a family line once exchanged devotion, sacrifice, or allegiance for survival, power, or provision, that exchange established a claim. That claim does not vanish when people become educated, successful, or even religious. It remains until it is confronted with superior jurisdiction. Midnight rituals are not about theatrics, they are about maintenance. Like renewing a contract, these acts keep old permissions active. Financial limitation is one of the clearest indicators of inherited spiritual claims. This does not always appear as poverty. Sometimes it appears as instability, leakage, sudden losses, or an inability to sustain growth. The person earns, but cannot keep. They build, but something always collapses at a critical stage. These patterns are signatures. They reveal that something older is still collecting its due. In the unseen realm, nothing collects without permission. Words are the currency of covenant. When vows are spoken, destinies are assigned. When blood is involved, permanence is implied. Scripture consistently shows that blood speaks, cries, and testifies. This is why midnight becomes so significant. It is when testimonies are presented, accusations are voiced, claims are restated. If no counter-testimony is offered, the older word continues to rule. Silence again becomes agreement. Many believers pray for blessing without ever addressing existing claims. They ask for increase while ignoring the altar that is still demanding payment. Prayer without legal understanding often produces temporary relief, but not lasting change. This explains why some breakthroughs feel real but short-lived. The system resets because the root issue was never resolved. True freedom requires confrontation, not denial. Redemption is not just forgiveness, it is transfer of ownership. When Scripture speaks of being redeemed, it implies that something was bought back from a legitimate claim. This is why revelation is essential. You cannot revoke what you do not recognize. Midnight activities lose their power the moment a higher covenant is enforced with understanding. When truth speaks, older lies lose authority. When light testifies, darkness loses its case. The issue has never been whether freedom is possible. The issue has always been whether the right authority is present to declare it. Spiritual intelligence does not function through chaos or impulse. It operates through precision, sequence, and timing. Nothing in the unseen realm moves randomly. Just as the physical universe is governed by laws of motion, cycles, and cause and effect, the spiritual realm is governed by appointed times, seasons, and patterns. Those who understand this do not merely react to events, they anticipate them. They recognize that transitions are more vulnerable than stable periods, and that thresholds are moments when authority can shift hands. Midnight is one such threshold, but it is not the only one. It is simply the most consistently underestimated. Cycles reveal intent. Repetition is rarely accidental. When the same financial obstacles arise at similar times, end of year, start of a new season, moments of expansion, it signals that timing is being exploited. Spiritual opposition rarely confronts at random moments. It confronts at moments of transfer. This is why major financial setbacks often appear just before breakthroughs. The objective is not only loss, but delay. Delay exhausts faith, weakens focus, and tempts people into abandoning their position. Time itself becomes the weapon. Understanding timing dismantles fear. Fear thrives on surprise, but intelligence thrives on expectation. When you recognize that certain seasons invite certain types of resistance, you stop personalizing the battle. You stop assuming failure, inadequacy, or bad luck. Instead, you begin to interpret resistance as confirmation that movement is occurring. The unseen realm resists motion, not stagnation. No one fights what is going nowhere. Patterns also expose jurisdiction. When outcomes repeat, it means the same authority is still governing that area. Change requires either the removal of that authority or the introduction of a higher one. Midnight activities rely heavily on consistency. They work because they are predictable, disciplined, and reinforced over time. This is why casual spiritual engagement is ineffective against structured opposition. Structure is not defeated by enthusiasm, it is defeated by superior order. Scripture emphasizes appointed times for a reason. Promises are not only about what will happen, but when it will happen. Missing the timing can be as costly as missing the promise altogether. Many people live with accurate beliefs but poor timing. They pray after damage is done, respond after opportunities pass, and discern patterns only in hindsight. Spiritual intelligence trains perception forward, not backward. When you begin to observe cycles rather than isolated events, clarity replaces confusion. You see that resistance at midnight or at transitional seasons is not a sign of abandonment, but of proximity to change. Awareness allows preparation, and preparation restores authority. The unseen realm does not respect ignorance, but it must respond to understanding. Timing, when aligned with truth, becomes an ally rather than an enemy. This is why vigilance is not about anxiety, it is about alignment. Watchfulness does not mean losing sleep, it means gaining insight. When you know when pressure will come, you are no longer intimidated by it. You meet it with order, authority, and expectation. And when authority arrives before opposition, the outcome is no longer negotiable. Financial stagnation is rarely the root problem, it is the visible symptom of an invisible dispute. People tend to address what they can see: income, expenses, opportunities, skills, while ignoring the unseen framework that determines whether those efforts are permitted to produce lasting results. In Scripture, lack is often portrayed not as absence of provision, but as obstruction of access. Wells were stopped up, storehouses were locked, harvests were delayed. These were not failures of labor, but interruptions enforced by authority operating behind the scenes. The unseen realm functions on legality. Nothing continues without justification. When progress halts repeatedly, it suggests that a claim is being enforced. Financial blockage is often the enforcement mechanism of a deeper spiritual argument. It is not punishment in the emotional sense, it is collection. Something believes it has the right to restrict flow, limit increase, or siphon resources. Until that belief is challenged, the system remains intact regardless of prayer intensity or personal effort. This is why many hardworking, disciplined, morally upright people experience chronic financial pressure that seems disproportionate to their actions. They are treating symptoms while ignoring the case file. They rebuke lack without examining why lack was allowed entry. They pray for open doors without asking who closed them and on what grounds. In legal terms, they are appealing emotionally rather than procedurally. The unseen realm does not respond to sincerity alone. It responds to jurisdiction and evidence. Midnight activity thrives on this misunderstanding. It reinforces claims quietly, without spectacle, counting on ignorance to keep opposition absent. As long as the believer interprets stagnation as bad luck, poor planning, or normal struggle, the deeper issue remains unaddressed. The enemy does not need to overpower, it only needs to outlast awareness. Delay becomes its greatest ally. Over time, frustration dulls expectation, and resignation replaces resistance. Scripture repeatedly shows that when the right question is asked, sudden reversals occur. When legitimacy is challenged, authority shifts quickly. The moment a higher court is engaged, the case changes direction. Financial breakthrough often comes abruptly, not gradually, because it is the result of a decision, not accumulation. Chains do not loosen, they fall. Doors do not slowly open, they unlock. Understanding stagnation as a signal rather than a sentence restores hope without feeding denial. It reframes the struggle from personal failure to strategic confrontation. The question is no longer, why am I not progressing, but what claim is restricting movement? That question invites revelation, and revelation exposes leverage. Once leverage is identified, the balance of power changes. The unseen realm cannot resist light indefinitely. It depends on secrecy, repetition, and silence. The moment the root is addressed, the fruit loses its grip. Financial freedom, then, is not merely about earning more, but about restoring lawful flow. When the obstruction is removed, provision resumes its natural course. Increase is not forced, it is released. Altars are systems of exchange. They are not primitive relics or symbolic metaphors. They are functional points of authorization where devotion, sacrifice, and agreement are translated into outcomes. Every altar answers to something, and every altar releases something. In Scripture, altars determined who had the right to speak into a territory, a family, or a future. They were not about location as much as allegiance. Wherever an altar stands, authority operates. There is no such thing as a neutral altar. If a righteous altar is absent, an unrighteous one eventually occupies the space. This is why Scripture repeatedly emphasizes tearing down altars before building new ones. You cannot simply add a new devotion on top of an old agreement and expect different results. Competing altars create conflict, and conflict produces instability. In the unseen realm, divided allegiance weakens authority. Financial outcomes are closely tied to altars because provision flows toward what is honored. What receives attention receives permission. What receives sacrifice receives influence. Dark systems understand this deeply. They do not rely on emotion, they rely on consistency. Small, repeated acts of allegiance, spoken words, intentional timing, symbolic gestures, keep an altar active. Midnight becomes a favored time because it is quiet, uninterrupted, and symbolically aligned with transition. What is reinforced at midnight carries weight into the next cycle. Many believers unknowingly maintain altars that contradict their prayers. Altars of fear, self-reliance, inherited tradition, or silent agreement with limitation continue to speak, even while mouths pray for abundance. An altar does not require conscious belief to function. It requires participation. Repeated behaviors, tolerated patterns, and unchallenged assumptions can all serve as sacrifices. This is why some prayers seem unanswered, not because they are unheard, but because they are contested by a louder voice. Righteous altars operate differently. They do not manipulate, they align. They do not demand payment, they establish order. A righteous altar restores proper hierarchy, placing God's authority above all competing claims. When this happens, resources respond naturally. Scripture shows that when righteous altars were rebuilt, famine broke, rain returned, and economies shifted. The altar did not create provision, it removed obstruction. Authority over resources is never accidental, it is granted. When an altar is active, it defines who has the right to collect, restrict, or release. This is why tearing down an unrighteous altar often produces immediate resistance. Resistance is proof that something is losing its claim. Silence would indicate irrelevance. Opposition reveals importance. Understanding altars removes superstition and replaces it with clarity. The issue is not ritual, but alignment. Financial breakthrough is not about chasing money, it is about restoring authority. When the correct altar stands, lesser voices lose jurisdiction. Midnight no longer belongs to darkness when light occupies it intentionally. Altars determine outcomes long before effort does. When authority is settled, results follow. Prosperity is not persuaded, it is permitted, and permission flows from the altar that governs the system. Ignorance is not a moral failure, but it is a strategic vulnerability. In the unseen realm, sincerity does not override law, and good intentions do not cancel consequences. Scripture makes this uncomfortably clear when it states that people perish not because of rebellion, but because of a lack of knowledge. What is unknown is undefended, and what is undefended is eventually occupied. This is why ignorance is so costly. It creates space for unauthorized authority to operate without resistance. Many believers assume that effort equals entitlement. They believe that because they pray, work honestly, and live ethically, outcomes should automatically align in their favor. But the unseen realm does not function on assumption, it functions on understanding. Spiritual laws operate whether they are acknowledged or not, much like gravity. You can be sincere and still fall if you do not respect the law governing the environment you are in. Midnight activity exploits this gap between belief and understanding. Ignorance often disguises itself as simplicity or humility. People say, "I don't want to think about those things," assuming avoidance equals safety. In reality, avoidance signals absence. Darkness does not need to be invited, it only needs to be ignored. When believers refuse to learn how authority works, they unintentionally surrender ground, not because they are weak, but because they are uninformed. This is why prayer without understanding often produces frustration. People repeat words without grasping the legal framework those words are meant to engage. They declare promises without addressing permissions. They ask for blessings without contesting restrictions. Over time, unanswered prayer erodes confidence, not because prayer is ineffective, but because it is misapplied. The issue is not faith, it is strategy. Those who operate in dark systems rely heavily on this imbalance. They study patterns, timing, and spiritual mechanics while assuming believers will rely solely on emotion and repetition. This creates an uneven field. Knowledge becomes leverage. Structure outperforms passion when passion lacks direction. This is not an endorsement of darkness, but an exposure of negligence. Light has always been superior, but it must be applied intentionally. Scripture consistently links revelation with freedom. Freedom does not come from wishing, it comes from seeing. When something is revealed, it loses its ability to operate covertly. Ignorance allows repetition. Understanding introduces interruption. This is why moments of insight often precede sudden change. Once the truth is recognized, the system can no longer function the same way. Learning spiritual law does not diminish dependence on God, it deepens it. Understanding reveals order, and order reveals authorship. The more clearly you see how things work, the more confidently you align with the one who established the system. Knowledge does not replace faith, it focuses it. Ignorance is expensive, but it is reversible. The moment understanding enters, authority begins to shift. Midnight loses its intimidation when law is understood. Darkness cannot argue with light that knows where it stands. Redemption is not a vague spiritual comfort, it is a precise legal transaction. It implies that something was legitimately held, a price was required, and ownership was transferred. In Scripture, redemption always addresses authority before it addresses experience. Feelings may change later, but jurisdiction changes first. This is why true breakthrough often feels sudden. When ownership shifts, outcomes follow without negotiation. What once resisted no longer has the right to do so. Revelation is the trigger that activates redemption in lived reality. What is already provided must still be recognized to be enforced. Many people possess promises they have never exercised because they do not understand the scope of what has been transferred to them. They live as though they are still petitioners when they are legally heirs. Midnight activity depends heavily on this confusion. As long as people behave like outsiders, outsiders will continue to dictate terms. Alignment is the practical expression of redemption. It is not enough to know that authority exists, one must stand in it correctly. Alignment brings behavior, expectation, speech, and timing into agreement with truth. Misalignment weakens authority not because truth changes, but because representation becomes inconsistent. In legal systems, a right unexercised is effectively surrendered. The unseen realm functions no differently. Breaking midnight influence does not require obsession with darkness, it requires confident occupation of light. When authority is properly aligned, darkness does not need to be confronted everywhere. It simply loses access. Doors close not because they are forced shut, but because permission is revoked. This is why Scripture emphasizes standing rather than striving. You do not fight for what you already own, you enforce it. Redemption also restores perspective. Financial breakthrough stops being the ultimate goal and becomes a byproduct of restored order. When authority is correctly positioned, resources align naturally. Provision follows purpose. Increase responds to governance. The issue was never whether supply existed, but who had the right to distribute it. The coming season will reward clarity more than effort. Those who understand alignment will move with confidence while others exhaust themselves pushing against invisible resistance. Midnight will continue to be a moment of transaction, but its outcome will depend entirely on who is present with authority. Darkness does not win because it is powerful. It wins where authority is absent or misaligned. When redemption is understood, fear loses its grip. You stop reacting to patterns and start interrupting them. You stop asking whether breakthrough is possible and start asking what alignment is required. That shift changes everything. Midnight becomes just another hour governed by truth rather than mystery. Authority does not shout, it stands, and when it stands in alignment with redemption and revelation, every illegitimate claim eventually collapses under its own weight.